The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Seeker After Truth by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Part 6. In Western Garb. Sufis in the West. Question. Surely your importation into the West of Oriental ideas through Sufi thought and literature must be seen only as the invasion of a foreign system, like the recent introduction of Hindu, Buddhist and Chinese ones, and nothing of permanent influence. If the Sufi forms and concepts indeed had the power to penetrate Western thought, surely they would have done so long ago. Answer. I do not know what you mean by long ago. It is true, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, that the word dervish appears in the language only in 1585, as the word fakir, originally Arabic for the Persian dervish, as late as 1609, and the term Sufi came here in 1653. Sufism itself is first found in the 19th century. This currency, however, is already far earlier than many of the intellectual and other concepts which are in the mainstream of Western thought, and earlier than recent Oriental imports. But we have hardly started. Ghazali, died 1111, the great Sufi of Iran, was so influential with the European, including English, medieval thinkers, that he was actually imagined to be an eminent Christian theologian, while Roger Bacon was teaching Sufi ideas at the University of Oxford soon after its foundation. The Franciscans, Dante, Chaucer, and many of the Western mystics of many centuries ago have been shown by European scholars themselves to have depended upon Sufi materials. In some cases, they actually copied from Sufi textbooks. I do not think that there is any parallel to this ancient presence of historical Sufism in the West in any of the Oriental systems you mention. We build on that foundation, plus the present state of Western society and thought. What the Orientals are doing, it is up to them to display and assert. As for my introducing Sufi ideas, you should remember that there is an astonishingly large number of books and monographs studying Sufism, entirely prepared by Western scholars, centuries before I brought these materials to the West. My activity is not introduction, but explanation and updating. Sufi activity, it could be claimed, has been rooted in the West for longer than most ideas which are said to be Western. Reasons. Question. What is the reason for the way in which your materials are projected in print? I mean, why do you translate some material, represent other portions, use Eastern similes in some, and Western psychological terminology and insights in others? Answer. There are two criteria. 1. What materials have to be projected at the present time to have the maximum useful effect? And 2. Who can absorb them and in what format? Sufic materials are always presented in accordance with the possibilities. This is because Sufism is not archaeology or hagiography, however much it may resemble them to those who look no further, but effect. Eastern similes which are still viable both in the East and West are used because of this viability. Superseded materials are not regurgitated just because they have been used in former times. Materials are represented if this can be usefully done. Western psychological terminology and insights are useful, so they are used. Look at the results. The published materials are read and accepted in both the East and West, by scientists as well as theologians, by ordinary readers in addition to specialists of all kinds. In a word, the presentation is effective. If there were no originating impulse from which the material comes, and which indicates how it may be used, we would be forced to present Sufi materials like you would any other dead corpus of law. You would rearrange, prune, and present in accordance with subjective assessments. We do not have to do this, since the material itself provides the guidance to those who can descry it. The question, however, illustrates the mind of the questioner more than anything else, for it presupposes that Sufi materials are like those of any other pursuit, capable of being manipulated by rule or whim. Had the questioner taken into consideration the Sufi fact that the teaching determines its method of presentation, he would not have needed to ask the question. Folk memory. Question. Traditions die hard, and folk memory retains many truths which are not known by scholars. Is it not worth investigating the psychological and mystical procedures of supposedly primitive peoples for forgotten knowledge? Answer. First, forgotten by whom? I am not aware of any psychological and mystical knowledge being needed, and hence sought for retrieval from anyone until the existing materials have been used. Your question is the same as the old one about inventing the wheel. Someone who knows nothing about the wheel may start to question whether there is perhaps not such a tradition in some primitive region. But has he or she asked the engineers if they ever heard of it? Secondly, folk knowledge is two-sided. Some of it is supposed to go back thousands of years. Very well. Now, look at this. The problem is who or what the clock, which is over 50 years old, commemorates. One group of historians are adamant that it was erected in 1916 as a war memorial, whereas another group assure me it commemorates the discovery of pasteurized milk. In 62 years or so, even scholars can't agree why a public clock was put up in Britain. The third point, of course, is the historians. Who is to do this investigating of the folk memory? Only people who know what they are looking for, not just another group of scholars who will disagree with one another. Our enterprise is experiential, which means, among other things, that what is discovered is factual and not susceptible to varying explanations. Men are not rats. When Pavlov showed that dogs could be conditioned, one retort of the time was, "Men are not dogs." Be that as it may, social and drinking habits among men, in the West at any rate, have been shown in the laboratory to resemble the behavior of rats rather closely. The psychologist Gaylord Ellison has demonstrated that when rats are offered alcohol, recreation, and food, in circumstances similar to those afforded man, they tend to adopt similar forms of behavior. The importance of this study is that it helps to approach the question of whether social and cultural behavior is in fact derived from the animal side of man. Within a few days of being put into their human-type setting, the rats developed patterns which mimic those of Western people. They went to the alcohol dispensers, as do Europeans and Americans, at a pre-meal cocktail hour. Concurrently, again as with humans in a similar situation, they combined this with social activity. Although the alcoholic drinks or water were available to them, they, like their human counterparts, abstained from drinking until it was time to sleep. As with many people of the Western culture, they had an alcoholic drink before retiring. From time to time, people in the societies where alcohol is widely used throw parties, drink a lot, and have hangovers. So with the rats. Occasionally the bar became a place for a drinking party. All rats joined in for this open house. As with human beings after a particularly hectic drinking party, the rats spent some days recovering, not touching alcohol, and imbibing quantities of water. Humans say that they drink alcohol to reduce tension, to be sociable, to do business with their fellow drinkers, to avoid loneliness, and so on. Can it be the same with rats? Hardly. The explanation seems that some social behavior, at least, is rooted in the animal level of behavior. Science. Question: are you opposed to scientists? Answer: no. But I am opposed to scientists not being what they think they are. I once went to a lecture concerned with blood transfusions, attended by a scientific audience, with a Sufi friend. The lecturer spoke disparagingly of the lingering folklore beliefs among ordinary people, and how scientists should work against these. My friend requested permission to ask a question. When he was given it, he turned to the audience and asked them how many knew to which blood group they belonged. 1/4 raised their arms. When asked which of them knew their astrological sun sign, everyone did. Reality and imagination. Question: are people really as stupid as the Sufis make out? If they were, how could society function as well as it does? How can one test whether people really do behave in such an absurd manner as some of the people in Sufi stories and teaching narratives do? Answer: people really are as stupid as the Sufis make out. Society works as well as it does because not everyone is stupid all the time. The Sufi enterprise helps them by showing up stupidity to forestall its appearance at times when it blocks understanding. There is little need to test whether people really do behave as the ones in stories and narratives, because the newspapers are full of accounts of this behavior, and hence it is displayed everywhere all the time. You do not need, after all, to test whether a cherry is red. You can see it easily once you know what red is. There are, however, many people who like, for one reason or another, to demonstrate human stupidity. Yaroslav Hasek, author of The Good Soldier Shrike, was one of these. He wrote an article in a zoological journal, which was highly thought of, asserting that elephants liked recorded music while tigers did not. When he published a treatise on prehistoric fossilized fleas, it was such a success that many European learned journals reprinted it. When he advertised thoroughbred werewolves for sale, he was inundated with orders for them. He put on a police uniform and told the rector of a Prague academy that he was under arrest, whereupon the man obediently followed him to a police station. By these means, Hasek showed that people will obey the symbols of authority, that they accept what is written in academic journals, that they will accept even werewolves if they are offered them, that they will publish tripe at the drop of a hat. And may I ask you a question? If people were not as stupid as they are made out to be, would they tolerate the kinds of individuals and organizations which exploit them? Who votes for the lying and improbable politicians who, remember, actually rule over so many of us? Confusion of superficial and perceptive. Question: the appreciation of art must surely be a higher perceptive function. When Sufis speak of the secondary self, which is composed mainly of the emotional and the learnt, do they not use the artistic sense to break through that barrier, testifying as it does to images and values far beyond the superficial? Surely everyone is agreed that artistic perception is on a much higher level than lower ones. Answer: Theoretically, this seems to be true. The Sufis say, however, that what most people take to be art is not art at all, but emotional and conditioned sources of stimuli. This does not mean that there is no real art. It does mean that Sufis hold that even acceptedly aesthetic people have confused learnt and automatic responses with perception. Question: this sounds very much like a posture to me. After all, how can Sufis establish that art experts are superficial? Answer: Sufis do not have to establish it, as it has already been established by the art experts themselves. You will recall in my Learning How to Learn how a man who wanted to get rid of the crowd around Van Gogh's paintings carved something out of corned beef and mounted it as Van Gogh's ear, and by this stratagem attracted the art lovers away from the paintings. This was a proof that art lovers, among whom were surely some experts, were more interested in what was in fact corned beef than in what was acceptedly art. But if you want a further example, there is one of Sunset over the Adriatic, exhibited in 1910 at the Salon des Indépendants, painted by Borinali. An Austrian collector bought the canvas after it had received acclaim by the experts as an outstanding example of the excessivist school. It was then revealed by Roland de Georges and a group of artists that the picture had been painted by a donkey to whose tail a brush had been tied. Borinali was formed by a rearrangement of the letters in the name of Ali Boron, the donkey in La Fontaine. Matisse's painting Le Bateau was hung for 47 days at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961, when about 120,000 people saw it without realizing that it was upside down. There are many true stories of this kind, which surely go far enough to establish that artistic appreciation and higher perception are not connected in the kind of art which is generally regarded as such. No, what is currently considered to be art does not belong to anything higher than emotion and implanted belief, and this has already been well illustrated, no matter what people may imagine. I have myself, in a certain artist's studio, witnessed a crowd of distinguished visitors, including eminent critics, rapturous over a bundle of rags which, as the embarrassed master painter confessed, were the pieces of cloth on which he wiped his brushes, and not works of art at all. So the conclusion seems to be the very reverse of what you believe. It is possible to illustrate that what is thought of as artistic appreciation is superficial, or at least is dependent upon unreliable feelings and social pressure. If it were to be held that there is something higher in artistic experience, the onus would be on those who claimed it to show that they have excluded these easily demonstrated subjective reactions. Real and unreal. Question: in Learning How to Learn, you write vigorously against such things as dressing up in ridiculous clothes and carrying out absurd exercises and watching fictional spectacles, plus being fascinated by distorted history. Now surely there is a strong interest in reality and in real life, even the most banal forms of these. Surely this is an excellent parallel to help to bring people to an interest in the true reality, which lies beyond ordinary reality, and which is the most real of all. What about the people who watch, for instance, documentary programs on television? Answer: I am glad that you asked that. A taste for reality is certainly a motif of a taste for objective reality, so that comparative reality, ordinary life, is a first step. After that comes the showing that ordinary life is not real, but perceived subjectively. But people have not yet become as accustomed as you may imagine to seeking reality. They still seek fantasy much more. I am not against fantasy, but I say that the search for too much fantasy at the expense of reality gives an unbalanced intake. If there are 3 concurrent television programs, which of them will get the largest audiences? The one which features bizarre dress and strange physical actions? The one which presents a human life? Or the one which is an emotionally charged costume drama? What proportion of each will the programs win? I will not ask you to guess at the figures, for the result will embarrass you. We have got some figures on this. The Paris newspaper François carried out a survey of viewing habits. They held a poll to see which of the following was being watched one night, and in what proportions. 1. It's a knockout with a mixture of sport and bizarre dress. 2. An historical costume drama. And 3. A documentary about the life of a woman. Here are the results. Percentage of viewers watching It's a Knockout, 33%. Costume drama, 67%. Woman's life, 0. Yes, I said 0. Disreputable. Question. I see that such writers as Norman Cohn, in his book The Pursuit of the Millennium, ascribe the rise of Christian sects wandering about and proclaiming the direct influence of God to Sufis and Sufism. He speaks of their debauchery and habit of eating revolting foodstuffs, and states that they reached Europe and influenced it from Muslim Spain. This is not the behavior which most people associate with Sufis. Answer. Cohn says that Sufism seems to have assisted the growth of the free spirit in Christian Europe. Certainly every one of the features that characterized Sufism in 12th century Spain, even to such details as the parti-colored robes, were to be noted as typical of the adepts of the free spirit a century or two later. All publicly manifested activities and some others have their imitators. The lunatics who go about India and the West aping what they take to be the behavior of Hindus influence other people. Are we therefore to say that these people represent Hindu influence? The cannibal who always said grace before eating people because missionaries had taught him to do so should not surely be considered without qualification as a Christian, or even under Christian influence. But your point is interesting, because we have a very similar development in the West today. Parallel with an increase in real Sufic activity, there are bands of people roaming the streets and filling the halls, enrolling disciples and generally claiming to be Sufis or pretending to be such. They will, in turn, have many imitators. But the features that characterize Sufism are not those which can be imitated, so Professor Cohn is being somewhat superficial here. Such cults represent the deterioration of Sufi behavior. They come about by the interaction between unstable imitators, would-be teachers, and emotion-starved, temporarily insane people, would-be disciples. What it really meant. Question. Modern science and contemporary ways of looking at things have enabled us to solve many mysteries of the past. The written records of the Sufis, admittedly, are often obscure because they are presented in a special way. But surely present-day scholars can decipher them when they know the point of view of the writers. Answer. Sufi writings are not all encoded. They depend, as often as not, upon someone having a certain experience before he can really understand them. And there are problems when you call in the experts, as a number of reputable scholars found out with a certain inscription not so long ago. One day, a small boy found a stone sticking out from the ground when he was crossing a field in southern Ireland. One side was smooth, the other had an inscription. This he showed to his local schoolmaster, who sent it to the university. There scholars became excited. One found that it was written in Hebrew, and he translated it as a warning of invaders who were to come. Another, however, was equally certain that it was inscribed in ancient Norse, and told of a battle against wild men after the writer had been shipwrecked. That is, until an ordinary student looked at it with the sun shining upon it at an angle. Then the message stood out clearly. It was in English and no more than 150 years old. It said simply, "June 1788. Am very drunk again this day." You will find this recorded in Frank Edwards's Stranger Than Fiction, London 1963, handbooks, pages 136 to 137. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.